The gunshot split the silence like thunder, sending a flock of startled birds into the clear Montana sky as Penelope Dawson ducked behind the water barrel, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had only wanted water from the creek, a simple task she'd completed hundreds of times since arriving in Whispering Pines 3 months ago. Now, as the echo of the rifle shot faded into the rolling hills, she realized nothing in her life would ever be simple again. Penelope peered over the barrel, her trembling fingers clutching the wooden rim. Another shot rang out, splintering the bark of a nearby pine. She dropped to the ground, the empty bucket rolling away from her grasp. Tears stung her eyes as she pressed herself against the earth. At 22, she wasn't ready to die. Not here, not alone, not with so much life ahead of her. The sound of pounding hooves cut through her panic. Through the tall grass, she glimpsed a rider approaching at breakneck speed, a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Before she could call out, the stranger vaulted from his saddle and positioned himself between Penelope and the unseen shooter. "Stay down!" the man commanded, his voice steady as steel as he drew his revolver. Another shot cracked through the air, and the man flinched but held his position. Penelope watched in disbelief as the stranger, a cowboy she'd never seen before, risked his life for hers without hesitation. His broad shoulders tensed as he scanned the ridge where the shots had originated, his body a human shield between her and danger. "Can you run?" he asked, never taking his eyes off the distant trees. "Yes," Penelope whispered, though she wasn't entirely certain her legs would cooperate. "When I say go, run for those rocks," he instructed, nodding toward a cluster of boulders 20 yards away. "Ready?" He fired 3 quick shots toward the ridge, then shouted, "Go!" Penelope scrambled to her feet, her skirts tangling around her ankles as she dashed for the rocks. The cowboy moved alongside her, his body still shielding her from potential bullets. They reached the safety of the boulders just as another shot kicked up dirt at their heels. "Are you hurt?" the man asked, finally looking at her directly. Penelope found herself staring into the most intense hazel eyes she'd ever seen, set in a face weathered by sun and wind, but somehow still youthful. A day's worth of stubble darkened his jaw, and a thin streak of blood ran down his left temple where a bullet had grazed him. "You're bleeding," she gasped, reaching toward his face before catching herself. "It's nothing," he replied, wiping the blood away with his sleeve. "I'm Henry Everett. Most folks call me Hank." "Penelope Dawson," she answered, her voice steadier than she expected. "Thank you for saving my life, Mr. Everett." "Hank," he corrected with the ghost of a smile. "And we're not out of trouble yet, Miss Dawson." Another shot ricocheted off the rocks above them, sending stone fragments showering down. Hank pulled Penelope closer to him, sheltering her with his body once more. "My horse is just beyond those trees," he said, nodding toward a stand of cottonwoods. "If we make a run for it, we can get you back to town safely." "Why would anyone want to shoot at me?" Penelope whispered, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. "I'm just the school teacher." Hank's expression darkened. "Some folks don't need much reason to cause trouble, but I aim to find out who's behind this." He checked his revolver, then glanced at the position of the sun. "We've got maybe 20 minutes of daylight left. We need to move before dark." As they prepared to make their dash for the horse, neither could have guessed how their lives would intertwine in the days to come, or that the shots fired on that spring evening in 1876 would set in motion events that would test their courage, challenge their convictions, and ultimately lead them to a love neither had dared to imagine possible. Hank surveyed the landscape, calculating their odds. "On my signal, we run. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Just follow me. Understand?" Penelope nodded, gathering her skirts in her hands. Her heart was racing, but a strange calm had settled over her. Perhaps it was shock, or perhaps it was the steady presence of this stranger who'd risk everything for someone he'd never met. "Now," Hank said, and they burst from behind the rocks. The shot came immediately, kicking up dust at their feet. Penelope stumbled, but Hank caught her arm, keeping her upright as they sprinted for the cottonwoods. His horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding, whinnied nervously as they approached. "Up you go," Hank said, lacing his fingers together to boost Penelope into the saddle. She gathered her skirts and mounted as gracefully as circumstances allowed. Hank swung up behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around her for the reins. "Hold tight," he instructed, and then they were galloping, the wind whipping Penelope's hair free from its pins, as they raced across the open meadow toward the safety of Whispering Pines. The shooter fired twice more, but they were moving too quickly, the targets too difficult in the fading light. Soon they were beyond range, though Hank didn't slow their pace until the town's scattered buildings came into view. "Sheriff Townsend needs to hear about this," Hank said as they approached the main street. "Someone taking shots at the town's school teacher isn't something to be taken lightly." Penelope twisted slightly to look at him. "You know I'm the school teacher? I don't recall seeing you in town before." "Just arrived yesterday," Hank admitted. But news travels fast. Not many educated young women venture out to places like Whispering Pines. Before Penelope could respond, they arrived at the sheriff's office, a modest wooden building with a small jail attached. Sheriff Townsend, a barrel-chested man with a silver-streaked beard, was just closing up for the evening when they dismounted. "Miss Dawson," he said, tipping his hat before his eyes narrowed at the sight of her disheveled appearance. "What's happened, and who's this?" "Henry Everett, sir," Hank introduced himself, extending a hand which the sheriff shook firmly. "Someone took shots at Miss Dawson while she was fetching water by Cottonwood Creek." Sheriff Townsend's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Shots? Are you certain?" "5 of them, by my count," Hank replied grimly. "One came close enough to graze my temple." He gestured to the dried blood on the side of his face. The sheriff ushered them inside, where Penelope sank gratefully into a wooden chair. As Hank recounted the details of the ambush, she studied him more carefully. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, worn denim, sturdy boots, a cotton shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows revealing sun-browned forearms. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster showing signs of regular use but well maintained. He wasn't flashy like the gunslingers who occasionally passed through town, but there was a quiet competence about him that suggested he knew how to handle himself in dangerous situations. "And you say you just arrived in town?" the sheriff asked, looking at Hank with a mix of gratitude and suspicion. "Yesterday afternoon," Hank confirmed. "Came looking for work. Mr. Davidson at the general store mentioned the Clayton Ranch might be hiring." Sheriff Townsend nodded slowly. "James Clayton's a good man. His foreman left last month, headed back east for family matters." "That's what I heard," Hank agreed. "Thought I'd ride out there tomorrow, see if he's still looking." "And you just happened to be riding by when Miss Dawson was attacked?" The sheriff's tone remained neutral, but the question hung heavy in the air. "I was exploring the area, getting the lay of the land," Hank explained. "Heard the first shot and saw her duck behind the water barrel. Didn't think twice about it." The sheriff studied him for a moment longer before turning to Penelope. "Miss Dawson, can you think of anyone who might wish you harm? Any disagreements or unpleasantness with the townsfolk?" Penelope shook her head, twisting her hands in her lap. "No, Sheriff. Everyone has been nothing but kind since I arrived. The children are wonderful, their parents supportive." She hesitated before adding, "Though Mr. Blackwood at the saloon has been persistent in his attentions despite my refusals." Sheriff Townsend frowned. "Victor Blackwood? Has he threatened you?" "Not explicitly," Penelope admitted, "but he's made it clear he doesn't appreciate being turned down. Just yesterday he mentioned that a woman alone in the West was asking for trouble." "That sounds like a threat to me," Hank said quietly, his jaw tightening. "I'll have a word with Blackwood," the sheriff promised. "In the meantime, I'll ride out to the creek at first light. See if I can find any sign of the shooter." He turned to Hank. "Mr. Everett, I'd appreciate it if you'd accompany me. Your fresh eyes might spot something I miss." Hank nodded. "Happy to help, Sheriff." "And Miss Dawson," the sheriff continued, "I think it best if you stay with someone tonight. Perhaps Mrs. Hollister at the boarding house." "I have my own cottage," Penelope protested. "The school board arranged it when they hired me." "Which everyone in town knows," the sheriff pointed out gently. "If someone's targeting you, that's the first place they'll look." Penelope wanted to argue further, but the logic was undeniable. "I'll need to collect some things from home first." "I'll escort you," Hank offered immediately. The sheriff nodded his approval. "Good. I'll send Deputy Willis to keep watch on the boarding house tonight, just as a precaution." As they left the sheriff's office, the last light of day had faded, leaving the street illuminated only by the warm glow from windows and the occasional lantern. Piano music drifted from the saloon, along with raucous laughter and the clink of glasses. "That's Blackwood's place?" Hank asked, nodding toward the two-story building with a freshly painted sign reading "The Lucky Strike Saloon and Gaming Hall." "Yes," Penelope confirmed, quickening her pace to put distance between herself and the establishment. "Victor Blackwood arrived about a year ago, according to Mrs. Hollister. He bought the saloon, expanded it, and now owns half the businesses on this street." "Sounds like a man who gets what he wants," Hank observed. "Not everything," Penelope said softly. They walked in silence to her small cottage at the edge of town, Hank leading his horse by the reins. The modest home sat back from the road, surrounded by a neat garden that was just beginning to show signs of spring growth. A small covered porch held a rocking chair and a pot of budding tulips. "It's not much," Penelope said as she unlocked the door, suddenly self-conscious about her humble dwelling. "It's a proper home," Hank replied warmly. "That's more than most cowboys can claim." Inside, Penelope lit a lamp, illuminating the tidy main room that served as both parlor and kitchen. A curtained doorway likely led to a bedroom. Every surface was neat, with small touches that spoke of someone making the best of simple surroundings. A colorful quilt draped over the back of a chair, a shelf of well-loved books, a vase of wildflowers on the table. "I'll just be a moment," Penelope said, disappearing behind the curtain to gather her things. Left alone, Hank moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The attack at the creek kept replaying in his mind. The shots had been deliberate, meant to kill rather than frighten. Someone wanted Penelope Dawson dead, and he intended to find out why. Penelope emerged with a small carpet bag. "I'm ready," she said, though her expression suggested otherwise. Leaving her sanctuary felt like admitting defeat, but she knew the sheriff was right about the danger. As they stepped outside, Hank placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Miss Dawson, I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to ensure your safety." In the lamplight spilling from the open doorway, his hazel eyes were earnest, his expression resolute. Penelope felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "Thank you, Mr. Everett, Hank," she corrected herself. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did." "Let's just make sure nothing happens now," he replied, helping her onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they rode toward the boarding house, neither spoke of the strange intimacy of their situation, his arms around her, her back pressed against his chest. For two people who had been strangers mere hours ago, they had been thrust into a bond forged by danger and necessity. What neither could have anticipated was how quickly that bond would deepen in the days to come, or how the threat that brought them together would test the limits of their courage, their convictions, and ultimately, their hearts. Mrs. Hollister greeted them at the boarding house with a flurry of concern, ushering Penelope inside while peppering Hank with questions about the shooting. A plump, motherly woman with gray-streaked hair and quick, kind eyes, she had taken Penelope under her wing from the moment she'd arrived in Whispering Pines. "You poor dear," Mrs. Hollister exclaimed, examining Penelope for injuries. "Shot at, in our own town. It's unthinkable." "I'm fine, Mrs. Hollister, truly," Penelope assured her, though her trembling hands belied her words. "Thanks to Mr. Everett." Mrs. Hollister turned her attention to Hank, noticing the dried blood on his temple. "And you're hurt. Sit down this instant, young man. I'll fetch some clean water and bandages." "It's just a scratch," Hank protested, but he obediently took a seat at the kitchen table while Mrs. Hollister bustled about, muttering about ruffians and lawlessness and what is this world coming to? While Mrs. Hollister tended to Hank's wound, Penelope excused herself to settle into the spare room. Alone for the first time since the attack, she sank onto the edge of the narrow bed, allowing the day's events to wash over her. Tears came then, silent and hot, streaming down her face as she covered her mouth to stifle any sound. She didn't want Hank or Mrs. Hollister to hear her breaking down. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Miss Dawson?" Hank's voice was low, concerned. "Are you all right?" Penelope hastily wiped her tears away. "Yes, just a moment." She took a deep breath, composed herself, and opened the door. Hank stood in the hallway. a clean white bandage now covering the graze on his temple. His expression softened when he saw her reddened eyes. "I wanted to say good night," he said, "and to tell you that Deputy Willis is outside. He'll stay through the night." "You're leaving?" Penelope asked, surprising herself with her own disappointment. "Mrs. Hollister has kindly offered me a room for the night," Hank explained. "I thought it best to stay close, given the circumstances." Relief flooded through her. "Oh, that's good." A moment of awkward silence stretched between them, before Hank spoke again. "Miss Dawson, I know we've just met, but I want you to know that I intend to get to the bottom of this. Whoever shot at you today won't get a second chance." The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent a warmth spreading through Penelope's chest. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Hank seemed taken aback by the question. He considered it for a moment before answering. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "because no one deserves to live in fear." Penelope studied his face, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive, but found only sincerity. "Thank you, Hank, for everything today." He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture both formal and endearing. "Get some rest, Miss Dawson. Tomorrow we start figuring this out." As he turned to go, Penelope called after him softly, "Penny, my friends call me Penny." Hank glanced back, a smile warming his features. "Good night then, Penny. Sleep well." But sleep proved elusive for both of them that night. Penny lay awake, reliving the terror of the shooting and wondering who could possibly want her dead. Across the hall, Hank stared at the ceiling, piecing together the little he knew about Whispering Pines and its inhabitants, particularly the saloon owner who had shown unwelcome interest in the town's schoolteacher. Dawn found them both tired, but resolved. Over Mrs. Hollister's hearty breakfast of biscuits, eggs, and bacon, they discussed the day ahead. "The sheriff will be expecting me," Hank said, accepting a second cup of coffee. "We're riding out to the creek to look for signs of the shooter." "And I should prepare for school," Penny said, though the thought of facing her students while O would be killer remained at large filled her with dread. "Absolutely not," Mrs. Hollister declared, planting her hands on her hips. "Sheriff Townsend sent word first thing school's canceled today. Parents have been notified. But my students will be just fine missing one day of lessons," Mrs. Hollister insisted. "Their parents would rather have them safe at home than at school, with their teacher being a target." Penny couldn't argue with that logic, though the enforced idleness would only give her more time to dwell on her predicament. "Maybe you should come with us," Hank suggested. "You might notice something we miss, and I'd feel better knowing where you are." Penny hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'll get my shawl." The morning air was crisp and clear as they set out for Sheriff Townsend's office. Hank led his horse, walking beside Penny at a leisurely pace that belied the tension both felt. Whispering Pines was beginning its day. Shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, the blacksmith's forge already glowing with heat, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery. Several townsfolk called out greetings to Penny, their eyes lingering curiously on Hank beside her. News of the shooting had clearly spread overnight, as many expressions held concern, and more than a few people approached to ask if she was all right. As they passed the Lucky Strike saloon, the doors swung open and Victor Blackwood himself emerged, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit despite the early hour, with a neatly trimmed beard and cold blue eyes. He paused on the boardwalk when he spotted Penny. "Miss Dawson!" he called, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I heard about your unfortunate experience yesterday. How distressing for you." Something in his tone set Hank's nerves on edge. The words expressed concern, but Blackwood's eyes held no warmth. "Mr. Blackwood?" Penny acknowledged stiffly, not slowing her pace. Undeterred, Blackwood fell into step beside her. "I've always said a lady shouldn't live alone in these parts. Perhaps now you'll reconsider my offer of protection." "I believe Miss Dawson has all the protection she needs," Hank interjected, meeting Blackwood's gaze steadily. Blackwood's eyes flicked to Hank, taking in his worn clothing, the gun at his hip, the set of his jaw. "And you are—" "Henry Everett," Hank replied without offering his hand. "I happened to be nearby when Miss Dawson was attacked." "How fortunate," Blackwood said, his smile not reaching his eyes. A mysterious stranger appearing at just the right moment to save our beloved schoolteacher. Quite the coincidence. Some might call it providence, Hank returned evenly. Blackwood's smile tightened. Indeed. Well, Miss Dawson, should you ever need assistance from someone more established in our community, my offer stands. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, but I'm quite content with the current arrangements, Penny replied, her voice cooler than Hank had yet heard it. With a tip of his hat that somehow managed to seem threatening rather than polite, Blackwood stepped back. As you wish. Good day, Miss Dawson. Mr. Everett, was it? As they continued toward the sheriff's office, Hank could feel Blackwood's eyes boring into his back. Friendly fellow, he commented under his breath. He's used to getting his way, Penny murmured. When I first arrived, he was all charm and courtesy. It was only when I declined his attentions that he showed his true nature. And the sheriff knows about this? There's nothing to know, officially. Mr. Blackwood has been careful to keep his interactions with me public and seemingly respectful. It's what lies beneath the words that concerns me. Hank nodded, understanding completely. Men like Blackwood operated in the shadows, using their power and influence to manipulate rather than force. It made them more dangerous, not less. The sheriff was waiting for them, mounted on a sturdy gray mare with Deputy Willis beside him. Miss Dawson, he greeted her with surprise. I didn't expect to see you this morning. I thought I might be of help, she explained. I know exactly where I was when the shooting started. Sheriff Townsend considered this, then nodded. Makes sense. You can ride with Willis. I've got some questions for Mr. Everett anyway. As they set out for Cottonwood Creek, the sheriff and Hank rode slightly ahead, their conversation too low for Penny to hear from her position behind the deputy. She watched Hank's straight-backed posture, the easy way he handled his horse, and found herself wondering about the man who had so unhesitatingly risked his life for hers. Where had he come from? What had brought him to Whispering Pines? He'd mentioned looking for work at the Clayton Ranch, but there was something in his manner, a vigilance, a readiness that suggested he was more than a simple cowhand seeking employment. When they reached the creek, Penny pointed out where she had been standing when the first shot came, where the water barrel still lay overturned, her bucket nearby. The sheriff and Hank dismounted, examining the ground carefully, while Deputy Willis remained with Penny. Anything? The sheriff called as Hank crouched near the tree line, studying the earth. Tracks, Hank confirmed, pointing to impressions in the soft ground. Boots, not moccasins. One person, I'd guess. Came from the ridge, waited, then left in a hurry once I showed up. The sheriff joined him, examining the footprints. Man-sized, not a very experienced woodsman left a clear trail. They followed the tracks to where a horse had been tethered in a small clearing, hidden from view of the creek. Hoofprints led away toward the west, eventually joining a more established trail that wound back toward town. Our shooter knew what he was doing, Sheriff Townsend observed grimly. Picked a good spot with clear sight lines, had a horse ready for a quick escape. This wasn't opportunistic, Hank agreed. He knew Miss Dawson would be here. The sheriff nodded, rubbing his bearded chin. She comes for water around the same time most days. Anyone watching would know her routine. They returned to where Penny and Deputy Willis waited. Did you find anything? She asked anxiously. Enough to know this was planned, the sheriff told her. Someone knew you'd be here and set up accordingly. Penny paled. So it was definitely meant for me? Not just some random act? I'm afraid so, Miss Dawson, the sheriff confirmed. Which means, until we figure out who's behind this, you're not safe. She can stay at the boarding house, Hank suggested, but that's only temporary. Sheriff Townsend nodded slowly. What we need is someone to keep an eye on her while we investigate, someone who can be with her during school hours and escort her around town. I don't need a babysitter, Penny protested, though without much conviction. Not a babysitter, the sheriff corrected. Protection. He turned to Hank. You were headed to the Clayton Ranch for work. That was the plan, Hank confirmed. I've got a better offer. Town council will pay you to guard Miss Dawson until we catch whoever's behind this. Room and board at Mrs. Hollister's, plus wages. Hank looked at Penny, his expression unreadable. That should be Miss Dawson's decision. All eyes turned to her. Penny hesitated, torn between her fierce independence and the undeniable reality of the danger she faced. This stranger had already saved her life once. Could she trust him to protect her going forward? As if sensing her uncertainty, Hank spoke quietly. I promise to respect your privacy and your routine as much as possible, Miss Dawson. I'm just there to make sure no harm comes to you. You'll need to be armed, the sheriff added. Deputy Willis can issue you a badge, make it official. Penny took a deep breath, weighing her options. The alternative was to live in constant fear, to jump at shadows and wonder if each day might be her last. She looked at Hank, at the steadiness in his gaze, and made her decision. All right, she agreed. But I still have a job to do. My students need their teacher, not someone jumping at every noise. Understood, Hank said with a nod. I'll do my best to be invisible during school hours. As they rode back to town, Penny tried to imagine what the coming days would bring. A stranger, now to be her constant companion, a shooter, still at large, and beneath it all, a question that troubled her more than she wanted to admit. Why would anyone want her dead? The answers, when they finally came, would shake Whispering Pines to its foundations and change her life forever. But for now, all she knew was that her world had narrowed to a single imperative: survive. And somehow, despite having just met him, she believed that with Hank Everett at her side, she might just have a chance. The next morning, Penny awoke to the unfamiliar sounds of the boarding house, Mrs. Hollister humming in the kitchen, floorboards creaking as other boarders moved about, the distant clatter of dishes. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented, before remembering why she wasn't in her own cottage. Someone had tried to kill her. The thought still seemed unreal, like something from one of the dime novels her students sometimes smuggled into school. Yet the memory of bullets splintering wood mere inches from her head was vivid enough to send a shiver down her spine. A soft knock at her door roused her from these dark thoughts. "Miss Dawson?" Mrs. Hollister called. "Breakfast is ready, and your protector is waiting." Penny dressed quickly in one of her simple teaching dresses, navy blue with white piping, modest and practical. She pinned her chestnut hair into its usual neat bun, though a few stubborn tendrils escaped to frame her face. A glance in the small mirror showed shadows beneath her green eyes, testimony to her restless night. Downstairs, she found Hank seated at the kitchen table, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt, though his clothes still spoke of hard work and open trails rather than town life. A deputy's badge now glinted on his vest, making his position official. He stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that seemed automatic rather than calculated. "Morning, Miss Dawson. How did you sleep?" "Well enough, thank you," she lied politely. "And yourself?" "Just fine," he replied with equal politeness, though the shadows beneath his eyes suggested otherwise. Mrs. Hollister bustled between them, setting down plates heaped with eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "Eat up, both of you. Can't protect anyone on an empty stomach." As they ate, Hank outlined his plan for the day. "I'll walk you to school and back. During lessons, I'll stay outside, keep watch around the building. Sheriff suggested I make my presence visible, might discourage our shooter from trying anything." Penny nodded, pushing her eggs around her plate. "The children will be curious. They've never had a guard at school before." "What will you tell them?" Hank asked. She considered this. "The truth, I suppose, in simple terms, that someone behaved dangerously, and you're helping keep everyone safe while Sheriff Townsend sorts things out. They'll have questions." "Children always do," Penny smiled faintly. "It's what makes teaching them so rewarding." After breakfast, they set out for the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building at the edge of town. Parents were already dropping off their children, many lingering longer than usual, clearly concerned about the recent events. Penny greeted each family warmly, introducing Hank as Deputy Everett, who's helping Sheriff Townsend with a security matter. The children, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, stared at Hank with undisguised curiosity, particularly the boys, who seemed fascinated by his gun and badge. The older girls, Penny noticed with amusement, were more interested in his handsome face and broad shoulders. Inside the schoolhouse, Penny called the children to order and addressed their questions directly. "Yes, there was an incident at the creek yesterday. No, none of you are in any danger. Deputy Everett is here to make sure we all stay safe. Now, let's open our readers to page 43. Outside, Hank paced the perimeter of the schoolhouse, alert for any sign of trouble. Throughout the morning, he noticed several townspeople slowing as they passed, eyeing him speculatively. Word had clearly spread about his role as the schoolteacher's protector. Around midday, as the children ate their lunches in the schoolyard under Penny's watchful eye, a rider approached a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, whose well-tailored clothes and confident bearing marked him as someone of importance. "Miss Dawson," the man called, dismounting from his horse. "I came as soon as I heard." "Mr. Clayton," Penny greeted him with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "You didn't need to ride all this way." "Nonsense," James Clayton replied, taking her hand in both of his. "When Sheriff Townsend told me someone had shot at you, I was appalled. Are you all right, my dear?" "I'm fine, truly," she assured him. "Thanks to Deputy Everett." She gestured toward Hank, who approached with measured steps. Clayton turned, extending his hand. "James Clayton, I understand I have you to thank for Miss Dawson's safety." "Just happened to be in the right place," Hank said modestly, shaking the offered hand. "Providence, I call it," Clayton declared. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Hank noticed that Penny's smile had become slightly strained. "The children need to finish their lunches before lessons resume," she said. "If you gentlemen will excuse me." As she walked away, Clayton lowered his voice. "Has the sheriff made any progress identifying the culprit?" "Not yet," Hank admitted. "But we're following some leads." Clayton shook his head gravely. "This town was peaceful before that saloon expanded. Now we've got all sorts of unsavory characters passing through." "You think someone from the Lucky Strike might be responsible?" "I think Blackwood attracts trouble like honey attracts flies," Clayton said bluntly. "He's brought gambling, loose women, and whiskey to what was once a God-fearing community." Hank noted the man's fervor with interest. "You and Blackwood don't see eye to eye, I take it." "Oil and water," Clayton confirmed. "I've been trying to get the town council to revoke his liquor license for months. Miss Dawson has been supportive of my efforts. She's seen firsthand how alcohol destroys families." "Has Blackwood made threats against her because of this?" Hank asked sharply. Clayton hesitated. "Not that I'm aware of, but he's not a man who forgives opposition easily." The school bell rang, signaling the end of the lunch break. Clayton mounted his horse, preparing to leave. "I should get back to the ranch. Please keep me informed of any developments, Deputy. Miss Dawson is precious to our community." There was something in the way he said precious that caught Hank's attention. A personal note, perhaps. He filed the observation away for later consideration. The afternoon passed without incident. When school ended, Hank escorted Penny back to the boarding house, where they found Sheriff Townsend waiting for them. "Any news?" Hank asked as they settled in Mrs. Hollister's parlor. "Nothing concrete," the sheriff admitted, "but there's something you both should know. When I questioned folks around town about who might have a grudge against Miss Dawson, a few mentioned seeing her having a heated discussion with William Taylor last week." Penny's brow furrowed. "Mr. Taylor, the mill owner?" "The same," the sheriff confirmed. "Care to tell me what that was about?" Penny sighed, smoothing her skirts. "His son, Thomas, is one of my students. Bright boy, good with numbers. I suggested to Mr. Taylor that Thomas might benefit from further education, perhaps even college someday." "And that led to an argument?" Hank asked, confused. "Mr. Taylor believes education beyond basic literacy is a waste for someone destined to work in the family business," Penny explained, a flash of anger in her eyes. "He told me to stop filling his son's head with useless notions and inappropriate ambitions. I may have been less than diplomatic in my response." Sheriff Townsend rubbed his chin. "Taylor's got a temper, especially when he's been drinking. And he's a crack shot, won the shooting contest at last year's Founders' Day celebration." "You think he'd try to kill me over a disagreement about his son's education?" Penny asked, disbelief evident in her voice. "People have killed for less," the sheriff said grimly. "I'll have a talk with him, see if I can get a sense of his whereabouts during the shooting." After the sheriff left, a heavy silence fell over the parlor. Penny stared into the cold fireplace, her thoughts clearly troubled. Hank watched her, noting the way her fingers twisted the fabric of her skirt, the slight furrow between her brows. "You're a dedicated teacher," he observed quietly. Penny looked up, her green eyes meeting his. "Teaching is more than a job to me. It's a calling. These children deserve every opportunity, every chance to become more than their circumstances might dictate." "Is that why you came west, To bring opportunity to frontier children? A shadow crossed her face. Partly. I also needed a fresh start. Hank sensed there was more to the story, but didn't press. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred to keep private. He certainly did. Mr. Clayton seems to think highly of you, he said instead, changing the subject slightly. James has been very supportive of the school, Penny acknowledged. His wife was a teacher before she passed away last year. Education matters to him. And does he matter to you? Hank asked before he could stop himself. Penny looked startled. He's a friend and a patron of the school, nothing more. After a pause, she added, despite what some in town might suggest, I have no interest in becoming the second Mrs. Clayton. I shouldn't have asked, Hank said, feeling suddenly awkward. It's not my business. No, Penny agreed with unexpected frankness. But I imagine you'll hear the gossip eventually. Better you hear the truth from me first. Before Hank could respond, Mrs. Hollister bustled in with a tea tray. You two look like you could use a hot cup, she declared, and I've baked some fresh ginger cookies. The interruption broke the tension, shifting the conversation to lighter topics as they enjoyed Mrs. Hollister's hospitality. Yet Hank found himself watching Penny more closely than before, intrigued by the hints of a complex story behind her calm exterior. Later that evening, after Penny had retired to her room, Hank stepped out onto the boarding house porch for a breath of fresh air. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Whispering Pines was quiet, with only the occasional light still burning in windows along the main street. He was about to turn back inside when a movement caught his eye, a figure slipping between buildings on the opposite side of the street. Hand moving instinctively to his holster, Hank watched as the person disappeared into the alley beside the general store. Curious, he descended the porch steps and crossed the street, moving silently as years on the frontier had taught him. When he reached the alley, he peered cautiously into the darkness. Two men stood in whispered conversation, their faces hidden by the shadows. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter and wiry. Something about their furtive manner raised Hank's suspicions. He strained to hear their words, catching only fragments. Should have been simple. Try again? Can't wait much longer. The taller man handed something to his companion, money, from the look of it. Then they parted ways, the shorter man heading toward the livery stable, while the taller one moved toward the saloon. Hank followed the taller figure, keeping to the shadows. As the man passed beneath a window lantern, the light briefly illuminated his face. Victor Blackwood. A cold certainty settled in Hank's gut. He'd found their shooter, or at least the man who had hired him. Now he just needed proof. Returning to the boarding house, Hank found Sheriff Townsend waiting in the parlor, his expression grim. William Taylor has an alibi for the time of the shooting, the sheriff said without preamble. He was at a meeting with the town council. Multiple witnesses confirm it. I might have something, Hank said, and related what he had just seen. The sheriff's bushy eyebrows drew together. Blackwood, eh? Can't say I'm surprised, but a conversation in an alley isn't proof. No, Hank agreed, but it's a start. Did you recognize the other man? Sheriff Townsend shook his head. From your description, could be one of several drifters who've been hanging around the saloon lately. I'll have Deputy Willis keep an eye out. We need to warn Penny, Hank insisted. If Blackwood is planning another attempt, let's not alarm her unnecessarily, the sheriff cautioned. Double your vigilance, certainly. But Miss Dawson has enough to worry about already. Hank reluctantly agreed, though he didn't like keeping information from Penny. As he lay in bed that night, sleep eluded him once more. The exchange in the alley kept replaying in his mind, along with Blackwood's cold eyes when he had spoken to Penny. What was Blackwood's true motive? Simple rejected advances didn't usually lead to murder. There had to be more to the story. The following days fell into a routine. Hank escorted Penny to and from school, maintained a visible presence during the day, and spent his evenings either at the boarding house or making casual rounds of the town, always alert for signs of the mysterious man he had seen with Blackwood. Penny, for her part, refused to let fear disrupt her teaching. Her students responded to her courage, though the younger ones stayed closer to her during recess, as if their small bodies could somehow shield her from harm. Hank found himself increasingly impressed by Penny's resilience and dedication. She never complained about the restrictions on her movements, never bemoaned her situation. Instead, she focused on her students, on bringing normalcy to what was an extraordinary circumstance. On the third evening, as they walked back from school, Penny suddenly asked, "Why did you become a lawman, Hank?" The question caught him off guard. "What makes you think I was a lawman before this?" "The way you move," she said simply. "The way you watch everything, everyone. You've worn a badge before, haven't you?" Hank hesitated, then nodded. "Texas Rangers, for a while. Before that, Union Army during the war. And after the Rangers? Drifted mostly. Took work where I could find it. Ranch hand, scout, occasional bounty hunting." "What brought you to Whispering Pines?" Penny pressed. Hank met her gaze, deciding in that moment to offer a truth, if not the whole truth. "I was following a lead on someone I've been looking for. A man who did something unforgivable a long time ago." "Revenge?" she asked softly. "Justice," he corrected, though the line between the two had blurred long ago in his mind. "And did you find this man?" "Not yet, but I will." They walked in silence for a moment before Penny spoke again. "We all have parts of our past we're trying to outrun or make right. I understand that better than most." The quiet confession hung between them, an invitation to ask for her story in return. But before Hank could decide whether to accept it, a shot rang out. Instinctively, he shoved Penny behind the nearest cover, a water trough, and drew his revolver. The bullet had struck the dirt just ahead of where they had been walking. "Stay down," he ordered, scanning the rooftops and windows along the street. Another shot came, splintering the edge of the trough. Hank spotted the muzzle flash from an upper window of the abandoned hardware store across the street. "Penny, when I say run, head for the sheriff's office. It's closer than the boarding house. Ready?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. Hank fired 3 rapid shots at the window, then shouted, "Run! Now!" They sprinted across the open street, Hank keeping his body between Penny and the shooter. 2 more shots followed them. One close enough that Hank felt the wind of its passing. They burst into the sheriff's office, startling Deputy Willis so badly he knocked over his coffee. "Shooter!" Hank gasped, pulling Penny down below window level. "Hardware store, upper floor." Willis grabbed his shotgun and headed for the door, but Hank stopped him. "Wait for the sheriff. This fellow's not amateur." Penny sat on the floor, back against the wall, breathing hard. "He found us," she whispered. "How did he know where we'd be?" "We've taken the same route every day," Hank said grimly. "My fault. I should have varied our patterns." Sheriff Townsend arrived moments later, alerted by the gunfire. Hank quickly explained what had happened. "Willis, get Miss Dawson to the boarding house the back way," the sheriff ordered. "Hank, you're with me. Let's see if our shooter's still around." But by the time they reached the hardware store, the upper room was empty, the only evidence of the shooter's presence being 3 spent cartridges on the dusty floor. The sheriff knelt to examine them. "Winchester rifle," he observed. "Common enough." "He's getting bolder," Hank said, peering out the window at the clear line of sight to where he and Penny had been walking. "Shooting in broad daylight on the main street." "Or more desperate," the sheriff countered. "Blackwood must be putting pressure on him." They searched the building thoroughly, but found no other clues. Returning to the boarding house, they found Penny sitting in the kitchen with Mrs. Hollister, a cup of untouched tea before her. "Nothing?" she asked, looking up as they entered. Sheriff Townsend shook his head. "He was gone by the time we got there. Probably had a horse waiting in the alley." "This can't continue," Penny said, her voice stronger than Hank expected given the circumstances. "I won't live as a prisoner, jumping at shadows. There must be a way to draw him out, to end this." "That's too dangerous," Hank objected immediately. "We need to keep you safe until—" "Until when?" Penny interrupted. "Until he gets lucky? Until he catches us unprepared?" She stood, her green eyes flashing with determination. "No, I refuse to wait for death to find me. I prefer to meet it head on." "That's very brave, Miss Dawson," the sheriff said carefully. "But I have to agree with Hank. Using you as bait is too risky." "What if it's not really me?" Penny suggested, an idea clearly forming. "What if it just looks like me?" Hank frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "A decoy, someone dressed like me, walking where I would normally walk." She turned to Mrs. Hollister. Lucy is about my height and build, isn't she? Mrs. Hollister gasped. You cannot be suggesting putting my niece in danger. Not in danger, Penny clarified quickly. Just visible enough to draw attention while heavily guarded. Meanwhile, I'll be somewhere unexpected, watching with the sheriff. And when the shooter reveals himself, we'll be ready. Hank finished, beginning to see the merit in her plan despite his reservations. Sheriff Townsend stroked his beard thoughtfully. It could work, but we'd need more than just Willis and myself for protection. And we'd have to be absolutely certain Blackwood doesn't get wind of it. We can trust James Clayton, Penny suggested. He has several ranch hands who are good with rifles. And I know a few men in town who'd be willing to help, the sheriff added. Former soldiers, steady hands. They spent the next hour refining the plan. Lucy Hollister, Mrs. Hollister's niece who worked at the dressmaker's shop, would wear Penny's clothes and bonnet, walking the usual route from school with a deputy. Meanwhile, Penny would be stationed with Hank in the steeple of the small church, which offered a clear view of the entire main street. Armed men would be positioned strategically throughout town, ready to close in once the shooter revealed himself. We'll do it tomorrow, the sheriff decided. I'll speak to the men tonight, quietly. Lucy can leave work early to prepare. After the sheriff left, Mrs. Hollister retired upstairs, still clearly unhappy about her niece's involvement, despite the precautions promised. Penny and Hank remained in the kitchen, the lamp burning low between them. Are you certain about this? Hank asked quietly. It's not too late to change your mind. Penny met his gaze steadily. I'm certain. I can't live like this, Hank. Looking over my shoulder, wondering if each day might be my last. I need to face this, to end it. I understand, he said, and he truly did. In her place, he would feel the same. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. The words slipped out before he could stop them, more revealing than he had intended. Penny's eyes widened slightly and a flush rose in her cheeks. I mean, he backtracked hastily. After going to all this trouble to keep you safe. I know what you meant, Penny interrupted softly. She reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching his. And I feel the same way. About you. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and new. Hank looked down at her hand on his, marveling at how small it seemed, how delicate yet. He had seen the strength in those hands, the determination in the woman they belonged to. Slowly he turned his palm upward, his fingers curling around hers. Penny, he began, not sure what he meant to say, but knowing he needed to say something. A board creaked overhead, reminding them they were not truly alone. Penny withdrew her hand reluctantly, the moment broken. We should rest, she said, rising from her chair. Tomorrow will require clear heads. Yes, Hank agreed, standing as well. Penny, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that meeting you, protecting you, it's been an honor. Her smile was soft in the lamplight. The honor has been mine, Henry Everett. As she turned to go, Hank caught her hand once more. Before he could second-guess himself, he raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Sleep well, he murmured. Penny's breath caught, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart race. For a moment, he thought she might step closer, that the fragile thing growing between them might blossom then and there. Instead, she squeezed his hand once before pulling away. Good night, Hank, she whispered, and then she was gone, her footsteps light on the stairs. Hank remained in the kitchen long after she had gone. His thoughts a tangle of conflicting emotions. He had come to Whispering Pines with a purpose that had nothing to do with Penelope Dawson. Yet, in less than a week, she had become more important to him than the mission that had driven him for years. Tomorrow they would confront the danger that threatened her. And after that, what then? For the first time in a very long time, Hank found himself hoping for a future beyond the next day, the next job, the next town. A future that, impossibly, included the brave schoolteacher who had stepped into his life like a ray of sunshine through storm clouds. With that thought warming him, he finally retired to his room, more determined than ever to see Penny safely through what lay ahead. Morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect spring day that belied the tension running through Whispering Pines. Word of the plan had been shared only with those directly involved, yet Hank sensed an unusual alertness among the townsfolk as he escorted Penny to school as usual. Perhaps it was simply that after 2 shooting incidents, everyone was on edge. The school day proceeded normally, though Hank noticed Penny seemed distracted, her mind clearly on the afternoon's events. When the final bell rang, Lucy Hollister arrived at the back door of the schoolhouse, wearing a dress identical to Penny's and with her dark hair arranged in a similar style. "Are you sure about this?" Lucy asked nervously as she and Penny traded bonnets. "Absolutely," Penny assured her, though her own hands trembled slightly. "Deputy Willis will be right beside you, and Sheriff Townsend's men will be watching from every angle. You'll be safer than I am most days." Hank guided Penny out through the back of the schoolhouse while the children departed through the front as usual. They made their way to the church by a circuitous route, using alleys and back gardens to avoid being seen. The church steeple provided an excellent vantage point, with narrow windows on all 4 sides, allowing them to observe the entire main street without being easily spotted. Sheriff Townsend had positioned men in the livery stable, the general store, the dressmaker's shop, and several other buildings along the street. James Clayton and 2 of his ranch hands were stationed near the hardware store, where the previous day's shots had originated. "Here they come," Hank murmured as Deputy Willis appeared at the end of the street with Lucy beside him. From a distance, with Penny's bonnet shading her face, the resemblance was convincing. Beside him, Penny gripped the windowsill, her knuckles white. "Where will he be?" she whispered. "Where would you position yourself if you were the shooter?" Hank scanned the street, considering. Not the hardware store, again too obvious after yesterday. He'd want elevation, a clear shot, and an easy escape route. His eyes settled on the back of the saloon, where an exterior staircase led to the upper floor. There, the saloon's 2nd floor has windows facing the street. As if confirming his suspicion, a shadow moved behind one of those windows. Hank tensed, raising his spyglass for a better look. "It's him," he confirmed grimly. "Same build as the man I saw with Blackwood." Penny leaned forward, trying to see. "Is Blackwood with him?" "No. He's alone." Hank watched as the man positioned a rifle on the windowsill, taking careful aim at Lucy and Willis as they walked slowly along the boardwalk. Hank raised his arm, the prearranged signal to Sheriff Townsend that they had spotted the shooter. Around the street, men tensed, ready to move. The gunman squeezed off a shot. Lucy screamed not part of the plan and clutched her arm as she dropped to the boardwalk. Willis threw himself over her protectively, drawing his pistol. "She's hit!" Penny gasped, her face draining of color. The street erupted into action. Sheriff Townsend and his men converged on the saloon, while Clayton and his ranch hands provided covering fire, pinning the shooter in place. "Stay here," Hank ordered, already moving toward the steeple stairs. "I'm coming with you," Penny insisted, following close behind. They descended to the church's main floor and out the side door, moving quickly toward the saloon. Gunshots echoed through the street, the shooter firing wildly at his pursuers, the lawmen returning fire with more restraint, mindful of innocent bystanders. When they reached the saloon, they found Sheriff Townsend directing his men to surround the building. "He's holed up in the back room," the sheriff reported. "Blackwood claims he's never seen him before, says he must have sneaked in." "Blackwood's lying," Hank stated flatly. "I saw them together." "We'll sort that out once we have our shooter," the sheriff replied. "For now, I need you to—" He was interrupted by a crashing sound from inside the saloon, followed by shouts and more gunfire. The back door burst open, and a man sprinted out, rifle in hand, heading for the livery stables. Without hesitation, Hank drew his revolver and fired, striking the fleeing man in the leg. The shooter stumbled but kept running, desperation evident in every lurching step. Hank took aim again, but before he could fire, Blackwood appeared in the saloon doorway, a shotgun in his hands. "Look out!" Penny screamed as Blackwood raised the weapon, aiming not at the escaping shooter, but at Hank. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, one from Hank's revolver, the other from James Clayton's rifle at the edge of the street. Blackwood staggered backward, the shotgun discharging harmlessly into the air as he collapsed. In the confusion, the wounded shooter managed to mount a horse and gallop out of town, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. Sheriff Townsend immediately organized a posse to pursue him, confident they could track him easily given his injury. Hank rushed to where Penny stood frozen, her face pale with shock. "Are you all right?" he demanded, his hands gripping her shoulders as he looked her over for injuries. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her voice shook. "But Lucy—" "Just grazed," Deputy Willis reported, approaching with the young woman leaning on his arm. Lucy's sleeve was torn and bloodied, but she managed a weak smile. "I'm sorry I screamed," she apologized. "It startled me is all." "You were very brave," Penny told her, embracing her gently. Braver than anyone had a right to ask. James Clayton joined them, his rifle still in hand. "Blackwood's dead," he reported grimly. "Shot through the heart." Hank nodded, feeling no remorse. Blackwood had been about to kill him, and possibly Penny as well. "What about the men inside the saloon?" he asked. "Being questioned by Deputy Schultz," Clayton replied. "But from what I overheard, most claim they had no idea what Blackwood was planning." Sheriff Townsend returned, having dispatched the posse. "We'll have our man before nightfall," he declared confidently. "Now, Miss Dawson, I suggest you return to the boarding house while we sort out this mess." Penny shook her head firmly. "I want to know why, Sheriff. Why did Blackwood want me dead?" The sheriff sighed, removing his hat to wipe his brow. "I suspect we'll learn more when we catch the shooter. But in the meantime—" He hesitated, then continued reluctantly. "We found some papers in Blackwood's office. Deeds, contracts, that sort of thing. Apparently, he was buying up land all around town, including the parcel where the school sits." "But the school land belongs to the town," Penny protested. "Not exactly," Clayton interjected. "The land was donated by my father with the condition it be used for educational purposes. If the school were to close, say, because something unfortunate happened to the teacher, the land would revert to the Clayton estate." Understanding dawned in Penny's eyes. "And Blackwood was trying to buy the land from you?" Clayton nodded gravely. "He made several offers, each more generous than the last. I refused them all. The school was important to Elizabeth, to my late wife. I wouldn't dishonor her memory by selling it. So Blackwood decided to eliminate me, hoping the school would close and the land would become available," Penny concluded, her voice steady despite the horrifying realization. "It seems the most likely explanation," the sheriff agreed, "though I'm sure there was also an element of wounded pride involved. Blackwood wasn't used to being refused by you or by Clayton." As the implication sank in, Penny swayed slightly on her feet. Hank moved to her side, his hand at her elbow, providing discreet support. "It's over now," he assured her quietly. "Blackwood can't hurt you anymore." The relief that washed over her face was palpable. "I can go home," she whispered, as if not quite believing it. "Back to my cottage, my garden." "After we catch the shooter," Sheriff Townsend cautioned, "just to be certain there aren't any more surprises." By sunset, word arrived that the posse had captured the wounded man just outside the county line. He was being brought back to Whispering Pines to stand trial. With that confirmation, the sheriff finally agreed that Penny could return to her own home, though he insisted Hank remain as her guard until the shooter was safely behind bars. That evening, Hank accompanied Penny back to her cottage for the first time since the ordeal had begun. The small home stood just as she had left it, though a fine layer of dust had settled on the furnishings. "Home," Penny sighed, running her fingers along the back of her rocking chair. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see it again." Hank remained by the door, suddenly uncertain of his place. The danger was largely past, his role as protector nearly complete. Yet the thought of leaving Penny, of riding out of Whispering Pines as he had planned before all this began, sat like a stone in his chest. "I'll check the perimeter," he said, needing a moment to gather his thoughts. "Make sure everything's secure." Outside, in the gathering darkness, Hank paced the small garden, his mind racing. He had come to Whispering Pines tracking rumors that the man he sought, the man who had killed his brother during a bank robbery 5 years ago, might be working at one of the ranches in the area. That search now seemed distant, less urgent than it had just a week ago. Instead, his thoughts were filled with Penny, her courage, her dedication to her students, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled. He had known her for only days, yet he couldn't imagine a future that didn't include her. When he returned to the cottage, he found Penny had lit several lamps, dispelling the shadows. She had removed her bonnet and unpinned her hair. allowing it to fall in chestnut waves around her shoulders. The sight of her like this, more relaxed, more intimate, made his heart skip a beat. "Everything looks secure," he reported, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "I'll take the first watch if you want to get some rest." Penny looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "When this is over," she said finally, "when the shooter is behind bars and my life returns to normal, what will you do, Hank?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Hank took a deep breath, knowing his answer might change both their lives forever. "I came to Whispering Pines looking for someone," he began slowly. "A man who killed my brother during a robbery in Texas. I'd tracked him through 3 states following rumors and whispers. The latest led me here." Penny's eyes widened with understanding. "That's why you were really here, not for work at the Clayton Ranch." Hank nodded. "But since I met you, since all this happened, my priorities have shifted." He took a step closer to her. "I still want justice for my brother, but revenge doesn't consume me the way it once did. For the first time in 5 years, I'm thinking about the future instead of the past." "And what does that future look like?" Penny asked softly, her gaze never leaving his. "Uncertain," Hank admitted. "Except for one thing." He closed the distance between them, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know I want you in it, Penny, if you'll have me." Her breath caught, and for a heart-stopping moment, Hank feared he had misread the signals, moved too quickly. Then Penny smiled, her hand coming up to cover his. "I barely know you," she whispered, "yet I feel I've known you all my life." "I felt it too, from the first moment at the creek," Hank confessed. "When I saw you in danger, I didn't think I just acted. Like some part of me already knew you were someone worth protecting, worth dying for if necessary." Penny's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "No one has ever put themselves between me and danger before. No one has ever made me feel so safe, so valued." Hank's other hand came up to cup her cheek. "You are valuable, Penny, not just to your students or this town, but to me. These past days have shown me what kind of woman you are. Brave, dedicated, compassionate, the kind of woman a man would be blessed to build a life with." The tears spilled over then, trailing down Penny's cheeks. "Are you asking to court me, Henry Everett?" "I'm asking for a chance," Hank replied, his voice rough with emotion. "A chance to show you that what's growing between us is real and lasting. A chance to prove I can be the man you deserve." Penny's answer came not in words but in action. Rising on her tiptoes, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that, while gentle, contained a promise of deeper passions to come. Hank's arms encircled her, drawing her closer as he returned the kiss with equal tenderness. When they finally parted, both breathless, Penny rested her forehead against his chest. "Yes," she murmured. "Yes to that chance, Hank. Yes to seeing where this leads us." The future that had seemed so uncertain just minutes before now shimmered with possibility. There would be challenges ahead, the shooter's trial, the question of Hank's long-term role in Whispering Pines, the ongoing search for his brother's killer. But in that moment, with Penny in his arms, Hank knew with bone-deep certainty that they would face those challenges together. As if reading his thoughts, Penny looked up at him with a smile that outshone all the lamps in the cottage. "Stay with me," she said simply. "Not just tonight, but tomorrow and the days after." "I will," Hank promised, sealing the vow with another kiss. "For as long as you want me, I will." Outside, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnesses to the tender beginning of what would become one of Whispering Pines' greatest love stories, a tale that would, in years to come, be told to children and grandchildren how a courageous schoolteacher and a wandering cowboy found each other in a moment of danger, and how that moment transformed both their lives forever. The morning after the shootout brought a flurry of activity to Whispering Pines. The captured gunman, who identified himself as Jed Mercer, a drifter from Missouri, confessed that Blackwood had hired him to eliminate Penny after his own attempt at the creek had failed. Mercer had been promised a substantial sum and a permanent position at the saloon if he succeeded. Blackwood was obsessed with that school property, Mercer told Sheriff Townsend during his formal interrogation. Said it was the key to his plans for expanding the saloon into a proper hotel and gaming house. With Mercer's confession and the evidence found in Blackwood's office, The case was essentially closed. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, especially when Sheriff Townsend announced that school would resume the following Monday. For Penny and Hank, the resolution brought both closure and new beginnings. Word of their blossoming relationship spread quickly through town, generating a fair amount of good-natured gossip, but mostly warm approval. Mrs. Hollister, in particular, seemed delighted by the development, commenting to anyone who would listen that she had seen it coming from the start. James Clayton was among the first to offer his congratulations, stopping by Penny's cottage with a basket of fresh produce from his ranch and a bottle of fine wine. "I couldn't be happier for you both," he told them sincerely. "Elizabeth would have approved, I think." "She always said you needed someone special, Penny." "Your wife was a wise woman," Hank replied, his hand resting comfortably on Penny's shoulder. Clayton's eyes grew distant for a moment. "Yes, she was. I miss her counsel daily." Shaking off the melancholy, he added, "I've spoken to the town council about making your deputy position permanent, Hank. We could use another lawman, especially with Whispering Pines growing as it is." "That's very generous," Hank said, genuinely touched by the offer. "I'd like to accept, but there's something I need to finish first. A promise I made a long time ago." That evening, after Clayton had gone, Hank explained his intentions to Penny as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I need to find the man who killed my brother," he said, his fingers entwined with hers. "Not for revenge anymore, but for closure. Robert deserves justice, and I can't fully move forward with our life until I've honored that promise." "Our life," Penny repeated softly, the words filling her with warmth. "I understand, Hank. Some journeys must be completed before new ones can begin." She squeezed his hand. "How long will you be gone?" "A month, perhaps 2. The trail leads to Colorado territory next. But I'll write when I can, and I'll come back to you, Penny. That's a promise I intend to keep above all others." "I'll be here," she assured him, resting her head on his shoulder, "teaching my students, tending my garden, waiting for the day I see you riding down the street again." They spent the next week in a bittersweet haze, making the most of their time together while preparing for their temporary separation. Hank familiarized himself with every detail of Penny's daily routines, mapping the safest routes between her cottage and the schoolhouse, meeting with Sheriff Townsend to ensure he would keep a watchful eye on her in Hank's absence. Penny, meanwhile, pressed a small daguerreotype of herself into Hank's hand, a gift to carry with him on his journey. "So you don't forget what you're coming back to," she explained with a smile that made his heart ache at the thought of leaving. The morning of his departure dawned clear and cool, with a hint of summer in the breeze. Penny walked with him to the edge of town, where his horse waited, saddlebags packed for the journey ahead. "I've never been very good at goodbyes," Hank admitted, taking her hands in his. "Even temporary ones." "Then let's not say goodbye," Penny suggested, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Let's say, until we meet again." Hank smiled, reaching into his pocket. "I have something for you, to make my intentions clear, to you and everyone else in Whispering Pines." He withdrew a small velvet pouch and emptied its contents into his palm, a simple gold ring set with a modest diamond that caught the morning light. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it with me since she passed, waiting for the right woman to give it to." Penny gasped, her eyes widening as she understood what he was offering. "This isn't a proper proposal," Hank hastened to add. "That will come when I return, when I can offer you a future unclouded by the past. But I want you to have this now, as a promise that I will come back, and when I do, I intend to ask you to be my wife." Tears spilled freely down Penny's cheeks as she extended her left hand. "I'll wear it gladly," she whispered, "as a promise of what awaits us both." Hank slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that had to convey everything: his love, his determination to return, his hopes for their future together. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Until we meet again, Penny Dawson," Hank said, his voice husky with emotion. "Until we meet again, Henry Everett," she replied, stepping back to allow him to mount his horse. "I'll be counting the days." With a final touch of his hat brim, Hank turned his horse and rode out of Whispering Pines. The image of Penny standing tall and brave in the morning sunlight burned into his memory, a beacon to guide him home when his task was done. The weeks that followed tested both Hank and Penny in different ways. For Hank, the trail led through rough country and rougher towns, following whispers and clues that sometimes seemed to lead nowhere. The man he sought, Frank Holloway, the outlaw who had shot Robert Everett during a bank robbery in Laredo, remained elusive, though the trail grew warmer as Hank pushed deeper into Colorado territory. For Penny, life in Whispering Pines resumed its normal rhythms, though everything felt somehow different. The town itself was changing in the wake of Blackwood's death. The Lucky Strike Saloon was purchased by a respectable businessman from Denver who renovated it into a more family-friendly establishment. The school thrived, with several new families moving to town, bringing children eager to learn from the teacher everyone spoke of with such admiration. Through it all, Penny wore Hank's ring, the small diamond catching the light as she wrote on the blackboard or tended her garden. It drew curious glances and eventually direct questions, which she answered with a simple, "Mr. Everett and I have an understanding. He'll be back soon." Letters came when Hank could send them, sometimes weeks apart, but always filled with his longing to return to her, and updates on his search. The last letter, arriving 6 weeks after his departure, contained news that made Penny's heart race. "I've found him. Holloway is working as a guard for a mining company near Central City. By the time you receive this, I will have confronted him, and, God willing, brought him to justice. If all goes as planned, I should be returning to Whispering Pines within a fortnight. Keep the lamp burning for me, my love." Those 2 weeks were the longest of Penny's life. She found herself watching the road leading into town, hoping to catch a glimpse of a familiar figure on horseback. Her students noticed her distraction, though they were too polite to comment on it directly. It was James Clayton who brought the news, riding into town at a gallop one Wednesday afternoon, as Penny was dismissing her class for the day. "Riders coming," he announced, reining in his horse beside the schoolhouse. A group of them, about an hour out. One of my hands recognized Hank at the lead. Penny's heart leaped in her chest. Is he all right?" "Appears to be," Clayton confirmed with a smile. "And he's not alone. There's a prisoner with them, and what looks like a U.S. Marshal." The next hour passed in a blur as word spread through town. By the time the riders appeared on the horizon, a small crowd had gathered in the main street. Sheriff Townsend stood ready to greet them, with Penny slightly behind him, her hands clasped tightly to stop them from shaking. As the group drew closer, Penny could make out Hank, riding tall in the saddle, his face weathered by sun and trail dust, but wonderfully, beautifully familiar. Beside him rode a stern-faced man with a marshal's badge, and between them, hands bound to his saddle horn, a haggard figure who could only be Frank Holloway. The riders clattered to a stop in front of the sheriff's office. The marshal dismounted first, approaching Sheriff Townsend with an official-looking document. "Marshal James Cooper," he introduced himself. "I have a prisoner bound for federal custody in Denver. We need accommodations for the night before continuing our journey." While the lawmen discussed arrangements, Hank swung down from his saddle, his eyes finding Penny in the crowd. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the distance, drinking in the sight. Then Hank was moving toward her, and Penny found herself running to meet him, propriety forgotten in the joy of reunion. They came together in the middle of the street, Hank lifting Penny off her feet, in an embrace that spoke of weeks of longing. When he set her down, his hands cradled her face as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. "You're here," Penny whispered, scarcely believing it despite the solid reality of him before her. "I told you I'd come back," Hank replied, his voice rough with emotion. Then, heedless of the watching crowd, he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. A cheer went up from the onlookers, led by Mrs. Hollister's enthusiastic applause. When they finally broke apart, both were flushed with equal parts embarrassment and happiness. "I have so much to tell you," Hank said, his arm still around Penny's waist, as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. "Later," she replied, glancing toward the prisoner being led into the jail. "You have duties to finish first." Hank nodded reluctantly. "Marshal Cooper wants to leave at first light. I need to help secure Holloway for the night." "I'll wait at home," Penny promised, "for as long as it takes." Home. The word had never sounded sweeter to Hank's ears. "I won't be long," he assured her, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead before rejoining the marshal. True to his word, Hank appeared at Penny's cottage as the sun was setting, having handed over responsibility for the prisoner to Deputy Willis for the night. He had found time to clean up, his damp hair and fresh shirt suggesting a visit to the barber's for a bath. Penny had prepared a simple dinner: roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread, which they ate at her small table, their knees touching beneath it as Hank recounted his journey. He told her of the false leads and dead ends. The moment of recognition when he finally spotted Holloway in a Central City saloon, the confrontation that followed. He denied it at first, Hank explained, pushing his empty plate aside. But when I described Robert, the way he'd raised me after our parents died, how he'd been unarmed during the robbery, something broke in Holloway. He confessed everything. Did that bring you peace? Penny asked gently, reaching across the table to take his hand. Hank considered the question thoughtfully. Not peace exactly, but closure. Robert deserved justice, and now he has it. Holloway will spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did. And you? Penny pressed. What will you do now? Hank's expression softened as he looked at her. Now, I keep the promise I made before I left. Rising from his chair, he moved around the table to kneel before Penny, taking both her hands in his. Penelope Dawson, he began, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. When I rode into Whispering Pines 2 months ago, I was a man focused only on the past, on settling old scores. I never expected to find a future here, never dreamed I'd meet someone who could make me want more from life than just the next trail, the next job. Penny's eyes filled with tears as he continued. You've shown me what courage looks like, not just in facing danger, but in facing each day with determination to make a difference. You've reminded me that there's more to life than vengeance, more to living than merely surviving. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a second ring, newer than the first, but equally meaningful. I had this made in Denver, to go with my mother's ring. Together, they make a set, just as you and I are meant to be. He took a deep breath. I'm asking you properly now. Will you marry me, Penny? Will you build a life with me here in Whispering Pines? Yes, Penny whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, Hank. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the second ring onto her finger to join the first, then rose to take her in his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the small church where they had once kept watch for a shooter. Now, the building was transformed with wildflowers and ribbons, filled to capacity with townsfolk who had come to witness the union of their beloved schoolteacher and the man who had risked everything to protect her. Penny wore a simple gown of ivory silk, ordered specially from Denver, with her mother's lace veil. Her father's watch, her only inheritance, was pinned close to her heart. As James Clayton escorted her down the aisle standing in for her father, who had passed away years before, she kept her eyes fixed on Hank, resplendent in a new suit, his face alight with love and pride as he watched her approach. Sheriff Townsend stood as Hank's best man, while Lucy Hollister, fully recovered from her wound, served as Penny's maid of honor. The ceremony was brief but deeply moving, the couple's vows spoken with such conviction that many in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. I, Henry James Everett, take you, Penelope Grace Dawson, to be my lawfully wedded wife, Hank declared, his voice carrying clearly through the church, to have and to hold. From this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Penny's response was equally firm, her green eyes never leaving Hank's as she promised to love and honor him all the days of her life. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Hank's kiss was both tender and passionate, a perfect balance that reflected the man himself. The church erupted in cheers and applause as the newlyweds turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Everett for the first time. The celebration continued at Clayton's ranch, where tables had been set up in the shade of ancient cottonwoods. There was music and dancing, abundant food and drink, and more goodwill than Whispering Pines had seen in many years. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the ranch yard, Hank led Penny away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. "Happy, Mrs. Everett?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. though I can't quite believe it's real. 2 months ago, I was just a school teacher fetching water from the creek. And I was just a drifter with a vendetta, Hank added wryly. Look at us now. Penny turned in his arms to face him. Sheriff Townsend told me the town council has officially offered you the position of deputy. Have you decided to accept? I have, Hank confirmed. And Clayton has offered to sell us that parcel of land adjacent to your cottage, plenty of room to expand as needed. Expand? Penny raised an eyebrow, a smile playing at her lips. Are you planning on a large family, Mr. Everett? I'm planning on whatever makes you happy, Hank replied, drawing her closer. But I do like the idea of little Everett's running around someday. A daughter with your eyes, perhaps. A son with your courage. And all with your protective instincts, Penny added softly. You stepped in front of a bullet for a woman you didn't even know, Hank. That kind of selflessness is rare. It wasn't selflessness, Hank admitted. Even then, in that first moment, I think some part of me recognized what you would come to mean to me. I couldn't let anything happen to you. Penny reached up to trace the faint scar on his temple where the bullet had grazed him that day. My hero, she murmured, then and now. As twilight deepened around them, they shared a kiss that held all the promise of their future, together a future neither could have imagined when fate first brought them together beside a creek where danger lurked and courage bloomed. 5 years later, Whispering Pines had grown from a struggling frontier settlement into a prosperous small town. The arrival of the railroad 2 years prior had brought new businesses, new families, and a sense of permanence that transformed the community. At the heart of this transformation were the Everetts. Hank had risen from deputy to sheriff when Townsend retired, bringing a steady hand and fair judgment to the role. Penny continued teaching, though now in a newly built schoolhouse with 2 additional teachers to help manage the growing number of students. Their cottage had expanded as well, with Hank adding rooms as their family grew. First came Robert James Everett, named for Hank's brother, and now a sturdy 4-year-old with his father's hazel eyes and his mother's curious mind. Then, 2 years later, Elizabeth Grace arrived, a green-eyed daughter who already showed signs of her father's protective nature, particularly where her older brother was concerned. On the anniversary of the day they first met, the day Hank had stepped between Penny and a bullet at Cottonwood Creek, they always took time to remember how their story began. This year, with Penny carrying their 3rd child, the occasion seemed especially poignant. While Mrs. Hollister watched the children, Hank and Penny rode out to the creek, now a popular picnic spot for townsfolk, with a small wooden bridge spanning its width. They sat together on a blanket spread beneath a cottonwood tree, Hank's hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of Penny's stomach. 5 years, Penny mused, leaning back against her husband's chest. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it's as if we've always been together. Best day of my life, Hank declared, pressing a kiss to her temple right where his own scar had faded to a thin white line. Though the day you said I do comes in a close second. Penny laughed, the sound as bright and clear as the creek bubbling nearby. And what about the days Robert and Elizabeth were born? Tied for 3rd, Hank conceded with a grin. This little one might just take 4th place. He patted her stomach gently. Unless it's twins, Penny teased. Matthew says I'm larger than I was with the others at this stage. Hank's eyes widened at the possibility. Twins? Really? It's just speculation, Penny assured him, though the thought had crossed her mind more than once. We'll know in about 3 months. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the play of sunlight on the water. So much had changed since that fateful day, yet the essential things remained constant. Their love for each other, their dedication to their family and community, the courage that had brought them together in the first place. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been riding by that day? Penny asked softly. If you hadn't heard that first shot? Hank considered the question seriously. I believe we would have found each other anyway, he said finally. Perhaps at church, or in the general store, or at one of Clayton's gatherings. Some things are meant to be, Penny. We're proof of that. She turned her face up to his, her expression serene in the dappled light. I used to think everything happened for a reason. Then I thought that was just a comforting myth. Now, with you, with our family, I believe it again. "As do I," Hank murmured, lowering his mouth to hers. Their kiss was interrupted by the distant sound of children's laughter. Looking up, they saw a group approaching the creek, their Sunday school class, led by Lucy Hollister, now Lucy Willis, after her marriage to the former deputy. "Mrs. Everett, Sheriff!" the children called, waving excitedly when they spotted their teacher and the town's lawman. "So much for our private anniversary celebration," Hank sighed, though his smile remained. "There will be time for that later," Penny promised, her eyes holding a hint of mischief that, even after 5 years of marriage, still made Hank's heart race. "A lifetime of it." As they gathered their things to join the children, Hank paused to help Penny to her feet, his hands gentle but strong, the hands that had once shielded her from danger, that had built their home, that cradled their children with infinite tenderness. "A lifetime with you," he echoed, his voice husky with emotion. "That's all I've ever wanted since the moment I first saw you." "And that's what you'll have," Penny assured him, standing on tiptoe to kiss him once more before they walked hand in hand toward the future they had created together, a future born in a moment of courage beside a creek where a school teacher gathering water had found not just protection, but the greatest love story Whispering Pines had ever known.